May 8, 1945. The outskirts of Hanover. Church bells rang across what remained of German cities. In London, strangers embraced in the streets. In Moscow, artillery fired into the air. Victory in Europe had arrived, sudden and absolute, like the collapse of a structure everyone knew was falling but hoped might stand a little longer. But for approximately 12,000 women gathered in makeshift processing centers across the shattered Reich, this day marked not liberation, but transfer. They wore the faded gray-green uniforms of the Wehrmacht auxiliaries, the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the communications helpers. Some still bore the tattered insignia of the Luftwaffe ground crews. Others had served as clerks, secretaries, radio operators, the administrative spine of a military machine that had ground itself into dust. They were not soldiers in the way men were soldiers. They had not carried rifles or driven tanks, yet they had manned switchboards during the bombing of Hamburg. They had plotted aircraft trajectories as Allied bombers turned Dresden into an inferno. They had typed orders that sent boys to the Eastern Front. The Reich had used them, and now the Reich was ash. Outside the processing barracks, American military trucks rumbled in columns, their canvas sides flapping in the spring wind. The sound was foreign, mechanical, efficient. German trucks, when they existed at all, coughed black smoke and died on the roadside. These moved with the confidence of a nation that had never run out of fuel. Inside the barracks, the women waited. Some sat on wooden benches, their hands folded in their laps. Others stood near windows, watching the Americans move through the ruins with the ease of conquerors. A girl of 19, her blonde hair still tied in regulation braids, whispered to the woman beside her, "They'll shoot us." The older woman, perhaps 30, though she looked 50, said nothing. She had heard the same whisper for 3 days, in different voices, always the same fear. The propaganda films had been clear. Americans were brutal, Americans were vengeful. Americans took no prisoners, and when they did, they made examples. But the films had also shown Americans as weak, sentimental, incapable of sustaining a real war. The films had shown a lot of things that turned out to be lies. A sergeant entered, clipboard in hand, his uniform clean and pressed in a way that seemed obscene amid the rubble. He read names from a list, mispronouncing most of them. The women rose when called, formed lines, moved toward the trucks. Some carried small suitcases, battered leather cases that had survived the retreat. Others had nothing but the clothes they wore. Anna Schreiber, 23, from Munich, clutched a notebook she had hidden inside her jacket. It was bound in brown cloth, its pages filled with small, precise handwriting. She had kept it through the final chaotic weeks, through the collapse of the Luftwaffe communications network, through the desperate westward flight to avoid Soviet capture. In it, she had written what she saw, what she felt, what she feared. May 8th. We are being loaded into American trucks. Some girls are crying, I'm not. I do not know why. Perhaps because I already cried everything out in the cellar at Dresden. Now there is only the waiting and the strange quiet inside my chest where belief used to be. The trucks rolled westward, through landscapes that no longer resembled Germany. Entire towns had vanished, reduced to rubble and scorched foundations. Fields were cratered, forests stripped to blackened stumps. Occasionally, a church spire still stood, solitary and surreal against the gray sky, as if God had forgotten to finish the destruction. At night, the convoys stopped at temporary camps where the women were given soup and bread. The bread was coarse, made from American flour, and it tasted wrong, too soft, too pale. But it was bread, more than many had seen in months. They ate it in silence, hunched over tin bowls, the guards watching from a respectful distance. One guard, a young private from Iowa, leaned against a jeep and watched the women eat. He had been told they were Nazis, true believers who had volunteered to serve Hitler's war machine, but they looked like the girls from his high school, thin and scared, their eyes too old for their faces. He offered a cigarette to the woman nearest him. She stared at it as if it might explode. Then slowly she took it, her fingers trembling. He lit it for her, and she inhaled deeply, her eyes closing. "Thank you," she said in broken English. He nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude, and walked away. The journey continued. Days blurred into one another. The rhythm of the trucks, the stops for food and water, the endless gray landscape scrolling past. Some women wrote letters they knew would never be sent. Others simply stared, their minds elsewhere, in homes that no longer existed, with families they might never see again. Margaret Klein, a former Luftwaffe plotter from Hamburg, sat near the back of one truck, her hands folded over a small photograph she kept in her pocket. It showed her mother and two younger brothers taken before the war, when Hamburg still had streets and houses and ordinary life. She had received no news from them since February. The city had been firebombed in 1943 and then bombed again and again. She did not know if the photograph depicted the living or the dead around her. Whispers circulated. The Americans were taking them to factories, to work as slaves. The Americans were taking them to camps where they would be starved. The Americans were taking them across the ocean to vanish into a country so vast that no one would ever find them. None of the whispers were quite right, but none were entirely wrong either. At the port of Bremerhaven, the women disembarked and saw the ships, massive gray vessels, Liberty ships, their hulls rising like steel cliffs from the dark water. Gangways stretched upward, and American sailors moved about the decks with practiced efficiency. The scale of it all was staggering. Germany had scraped together every resource to build a handful of U-boats America-built fleets. The women were processed again, names checked, documents stamped, identification tags issued. They were herded into the ship's hold, a cavernous space lined with bunks stacked 3 high. It smelled of oil and salt and metal. Some women vomited immediately, the motion of the ship compounding the fear in their stomachs. Others lay still, staring at the ceiling. Waiting for whatever came next, Anna wrote in her notebook by the dim light of a single bulb. "We are crossing the Atlantic. Some say we are being taken to America. I do not believe it. Why would they take us so far? Unless it is to ensure we can never return. My mother used to say, 'The devil takes you where no one can hear you scream.' Perhaps America is that place." The crossing took 12 days. The women were fed twice daily, thin stew and hard biscuits, food that was barely adequate but still more than many had eaten in the final months of the war. Seasickness was epidemic, the bunks reeking of vomit and sweat. Some women prayed, others sang quietly, old folk songs that sounded hollow in the metal tomb of the ship's hold above deck. American sailors went about their duties, occasionally glancing down at the prisoners below. They had been told the women were war criminals, party members, fanatics, but the reports didn't match the reality. Mostly, they looked like refugees. On the 8th day, the ocean grew rougher and the ship pitched violently. Women clung to their bunks, some crying out, others silent. Anna held her notebook to her chest as if it were a talisman. The only thing she still owned that connected her to the person she had been before the war reshaped her into something she no longer recognized. When the ship finally reached New York Harbor, the women were not allowed on deck to see the city. They remained below, hearing only the shouts of dock workers and the groan of machinery as cargo was unloaded. Then, once more, they were moved. Onto trains this time, long passenger cars with barred windows. The train rolled west. For 3 days, they watched America unfold outside the windows. Fields so vast they seemed endless. Towns untouched by war. Their buildings intact. Their streets clean. Children playing in yards. Women hanging laundry cars, moving on paved roads. It was impossible. They had been told America was weak, decadent, barely holding together under the weight of its own contradictions. But what they saw was order, abundance, a nation that had fought a global war and still had enough left over to pave roads and build schools and let children play in safety. Margaret stared out the window at a small town in Indiana, where a woman stood in her garden watering flowers. Just watering flowers, as if the world had not been on fire for 6 years. "It's not real," Margaret whispered. "It can't be." But it was. The train arrived at Camp Shanks, New York, and then continued to smaller camps scattered across the Midwest and South. The women were divided into groups, processed once more, and assigned to barracks. At Fort Des Moines, Iowa, 200 German women stepped off the train into the summer heat, their uniforms soaked with sweat, their faces pale with exhaustion. They had expected brutality, starvation, cruelty. What they found instead was something far more disorienting. order, routine, and the quiet, relentless efficiency of a nation that had no need to prove itself through violence. The camp was arranged in neat rows, wooden barracks painted white, gravel paths swept clean. American flags hung limply in the humid air. Guards stood at regular intervals, rifles slung over their shoulders, but they did not shout or menace. They simply stood, watching. Anna and the others were led to their barracks, where bunks had been prepared with mattresses, blankets, and pillows, real pillows. Some women touched them as if they might vanish. Others sat heavily on the edge of the bunks, too tired to process what they were seeing. A female American officer entered, clipboard in hand, her uniform crisp despite the heat. She spoke in German, her accent rough but understandable. "You will be given work assignments tomorrow. Tonight you will eat and you will rest. There are washing facilities at the end of the barracks. You are expected to maintain cleanliness and order." She paused, looking over the assembled women, and her expression softened slightly. "You are prisoners of war, but you will be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. If you have questions, ask your barracks supervisor." Then she left. The women sat in silence, the weight of the officer's words settling over them. Treated according to the Geneva Conventions. They had heard the phrase before, in propaganda broadcasts that mocked the Allies for their weakness, their sentimentality, their inability to wage total war. But now, sitting in a clean barracks with a real mattress beneath her, Anna wondered if perhaps the propaganda had been wrong about that too. The next morning, a bell rang at 6. The women rose stiffly, uncertain of what was expected. Some fumbled to make their beds, military precision drilled into them from years of service. Others stood by their bunks waiting for orders. The barracks supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Callahan, entered with a cart. On it were stacked towels, bars of soap, and small bottles. She spoke in halting German. "This is for washing, soap, shampoo, towels. You will use the facilities before breakfast." She gestured toward the end of the barracks, where a door led to a separate building. The women stared at the cart as if it had materialized from another dimension. Soap. Real soap. Not the gritty gray substance the Wehrmacht had issued, which barely foamed and smelled of lye. This was white, clean, wrapped in paper, and it smelled faintly of lavender. Anna picked up a bar, turning it over in her hands. It felt absurdly luxurious, almost obscene in its softness. Around her, other women did the same, their expressions caught between disbelief and something close to grief. Margaret whispered, "They give this to prisoners?" Mrs. Callahan, who didn't understand the German, smiled politely and gestured again toward the washrooms. One by one, the women filed out, carrying their towels and soap. The washing facility was larger than expected, with rows of shower heads and sinks all gleaming with recent cleaning. Steam rose from the drains, evidence that hot water was available. Hot water. In captivity. Anna stepped under the shower, turned the handle, and gasped as warm water poured over her. She had not felt hot water in over a year. The last shower she remembered had been cold, rationed, in a bombed-out barracks outside Berlin. She had scrubbed herself with a sliver of soap smaller than her thumb and dried herself with her undershirt. Now she stood under an endless stream, the water washing away layers of grime, sweat, fear. She lathered her hair with the shampoo, and the scent, clean, floral, impossibly gentle, brought tears she hadn't known she still had inside her around her. Other women stood under the showers, silent, their faces turned upward as if in prayer. Some wept openly. Others simply stood, eyes closed, letting the water run when they emerged, towels wrapped around their shoulders, their skin pink and clean. They looked at one another as if seeing strangers. Without the grime, the exhaustion written into every line, they looked younger, more human. Less like the remnants of a defeated army, and more like the girls they had been before the war had claimed them. Breakfast was served in a mess hall, long tables arranged in rows, metal trays set at each place. The women filed in, still damp from the showers, their hair beginning to dry in the warm morning air. They sat, unsure of what to expect, and then the food arrived. Scrambled eggs, toast with butter, oatmeal with sugar, coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz sludge they had choked down for years. Milk, fresh milk. Anna stared at her tray. The eggs were yellow, pale yellow, the color of eggs that came from chickens fed real grain. The toast was soft, the butter thick and creamy. She picked up her fork, her hand shaking slightly, and took a bite. It tasted like something from before the war, from a childhood she had almost forgotten. It tasted like normalcy. Around the hall, silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of women too stunned to speak. They ate slowly, mechanically, as if the act of eating this food might trigger some punishment, some revelation that it was all a trick. But nothing happened. The guards stood at their posts, not watching with suspicion, but with the bored detachment of men who had seen this scene 100 times. Margaret swallowed a spoonful of oatmeal, the sweetness almost painful after months of black bread and thin soup. She looked across the table at Anna, and their eyes met. "This isn't real," Margaret said quietly. "It can't be." Anna nodded, but she didn't stop eating. After breakfast, they were led to a supply building where they were issued new clothing. Not uniforms exactly, but simple cotton dresses, plain and functional, along with undergarments, socks, and shoes. The clothes were clean, new, and they fit. Anna held the dress in her hands, running her fingers over the fabric. It was soft, undamaged, free of patches or repairs. She had not worn anything new in 3 years. In Germany, clothing was rationed, mended until it fell apart, and then mended again. This dress had never been worn. It had been made specifically to be given away. The women changed in the barracks, shedding their Wehrmacht gray for the soft cotton. Some stood before the small mirrors provided, staring at themselves as if meeting strangers. Without the uniform, they were no longer soldiers, no longer part of the machine. They were just women, dressed in simple clothes, their reflections unfamiliar. That afternoon, work assignments were distributed. Most of the women were assigned to the camp laundry, the kitchens, or the administrative offices. The work was not hard, not compared to the desperate labor of the Reich's final months, when they had hauled rubble and manned searchlights and worked until their hands bled. Here, the work was orderly, structured, and the guards did not scream or strike. They simply explained the task, demonstrated once, and left the women to it. In the laundry, Anna stood at a large industrial washing machine, feeding in sheets and towels. The machine hummed with mechanical precision, steam rising as it agitated the fabric. Beside her, Margaret operated a pressing iron, smoothing wrinkles from pillowcases. They worked in silence for a time, and then Margaret spoke, her voice low. "Do you think this is punishment?" Anna paused, considering. "What do you mean?" "This." Margaret gestured around the laundry room at the clean floors, the functioning machines, the stack of fresh linens, treating us well, feeding us, giving us soap. Maybe it's meant to break us, to make us feel ashamed. Anna didn't answer immediately. She watched the sheets tumble in the machine, the water sloshing, and she thought about the propaganda she had believed, the stories of American cruelty, the warnings that surrender meant degradation. "I don't know," she said finally. "But if it's punishment, it's a strange kind." At lunch, the women returned to the mess hall. The trays were laid out again, this time with sandwiches, thick slices of bread with ham and cheese, alongside bowls of soup and cups of lemonade. Sweet, cold, impossibly refreshing in the summer heat. Anna drank hers slowly, savoring the taste, and she thought of her mother's kitchen in Munich, where before the war they had sometimes made lemonade on hot days, squeezing lemons from the garden, adding sugar from the ration. This lemonade was better, sweeter, more abundant. And that was the problem, wasn't it? This abundance. This casual, careless generosity. The Reich had demanded total sacrifice, every resource funneled into the war machine, every ounce of food rationed, every scrap of clothing mended. And for what? To lose? To be defeated by a nation that could afford to give soap and lemonade to its prisoners. That evening, after the work was done, the women gathered in the barracks. Some wrote letters, though they were told mail to Germany would be delayed indefinitely. Others sat quietly, staring at nothing, their minds far away. Mrs. Callahan returned, this time with another cart, and on it was something that made several women gasp aloud. Apples. Fresh apples, red and green and shining, piled high in a basket. She handed one to each woman, smiling as she moved down the row of bunks. Anna held the apple in both hands. She had not seen a fresh apple since before the war. In Germany, fruit had become a memory, something reserved for children and the sick, something traded on the black market for prices no one could afford. She bit into it, and the juice ran down her chin, sweet and crisp and impossibly alive. Around her, other women did the same, and the barracks filled with the sound of chewing, the wet crunch of fruit, and the occasional sob. Margaret ate her apple slowly, methodically, as if afraid it might vanish. When she finished, she stared at the core, the seeds visible inside, and she thought of her mother's garden in Hamburg, where apple trees had once grown. But Hamburg was rubble now, the trees burned, the garden buried under ash. They don't know, Margaret said quietly, to no one in particular, the Americans. They don't know what it's like to have nothing. Anna looked up from her own apple core. No, they don't. And that perhaps was the most disorienting thing of all. The Americans fed them not out of cruelty, not as a taunt, but simply because they could. Because to them, an apple was not a luxury. It was ordinary. That night, Anna lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, the taste of apple still lingering in her mouth. Outside, crickets chirped in the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a radio played American music, the notes drifting through the warm night air. She thought of her mother, of her younger sister, still in Munich if they were alive, living in the ruins, scavenging for food, wearing the same dress they had worn for 3 years. And here she was, a prisoner, fed and clean and safe. The guilt settled over her like a weight, and she turned her face to the wall so that no one would see her cry. The routine became familiar. Wake at 6, shower with soap and hot water, breakfast with eggs and coffee, work in the laundry or kitchen or office, lunch with sandwiches and lemonade, more work, dinner with meat and vegetables, evening in the barracks, reading or writing or simply sitting. It was a life. Not freedom, but not suffering either. A strange liminal space where the women existed between the war they had lost and the future they could not yet imagine. But the guilt did not fade. If anything, it grew sharper with each meal, each bar of soap, each clean dress. Letters began to arrive from home, smuggled through the Red Cross, censored but still painfully real. They spoke of hunger, of bombed-out cities, of children coughing in the cold. One woman received a letter from her sister, describing how they had boiled leather to make soup. Another read that her mother had died of starvation in February, and no one had been able to tell her until now. Anna received a letter from her mother in late July. The envelope was thin, the paper worn as if it had traveled through many hands. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling. My dearest Anna, I pray this reaches you, wherever you are. We heard you were taken by the Americans, and we do not know if that means you are safe or lost. The city is unrecognizable. Our house is gone. We live now in the cellar of what used to be the Braun family home. Your sister and I share a single blanket. Food is impossible. Yesterday we waited 4 hours for a ration of bread, and when our turn came, there was none left. If you are alive, if you are reading this, know that I thank God you are away from here. Whatever you are enduring, it cannot be worse than this. Do not try to come home. There is nothing here but ash. I love you. I have always loved you. Dear Mother Trends. Anna folded the letter carefully, her hands shaking, and placed it in her notebook. Around her, other women sat with their own letters, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. That night at dinner, the mess hall felt different. The trays were the same. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, a roll with butter. But the women ate mechanically, their minds elsewhere. One woman, Greta, a former clerk from Berlin, pushed her tray away abruptly and stood, her face flushed with anger. How can we eat this? She said loudly, her voice shaking. How can we sit here and eat like this is normal? The mess hall fell silent. Guards looked up, uncertain. Mrs. Callahan stepped forward, but Greta turned on her, tears streaming down her face. Do you know what's happening in Germany? Do you know what they're eating? Nothing. Scraps. Garbage. And here we are, prisoners, eating like... Like, she broke off, unable to continue, and sat down heavily, her head in her hands. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, oppressive, filled with the weight of unspoken guilt. After a long moment, the women resumed eating, but the taste of the food was ashes in their mouths. Later in the barracks, Anna wrote in her notebook, Greta is right, this is unbearable, not because they treat us poorly, but because they treat us well. Every meal is a betrayal. Every clean sheet is a reminder that my family sleeps in ruins. I wish they would beat us. I wish they would starve us. At least then I would know what I'm supposed to feel. The camp administrators noticed the shift in morale. Reports filtered up to the command, noting increased incidents of refusal to eat, women hoarding food, signs of depression, and survivors' guilt. A decision was made. One evening, the women were summoned to the mess hall where a screen had been set up at one end. They filed in, confused, and took their seats. The guards dimmed the lights and a projector whirred to life. The film that played was not what they expected. It was footage from the liberation of the concentration camps Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The screen filled with images of skeletal figures, mass graves, piles of shoes, and glasses, and shorn hair. The women watched in silence, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. Some covered their mouths. Others stared, unable to look away. A few got up and left, stumbling out into the night air, retching. When the film ended, the lights came on, and the camp commander, a colonel named Patterson, stood before them. He spoke in German, his voice measured but firm. You have said that you are ashamed to be treated well while your families suffer. I understand that feeling, but I want you to understand something else. He gestured to the screen, now blank. This is what your government did. This is what the Reich created. These camps were not military operations. They were factories of death, designed to exterminate human beings for no reason other than who they were: Jews, Poles, Romani, Soviet prisoners, millions. He paused, letting the words sink in. You served that government. You typed its orders. You manned its communications. You were part of the machine that made this possible. And now you sit here, fed and clean and safe, and you feel guilty. Good. You should feel guilty, but not because you are prisoners. You should feel guilty because you were part of this. He left. The women sat in stunned silence. The images burned into their minds. Anna felt something inside her crack, a fissure that had been forming for weeks but had not yet split open. She thought of the orders she had typed, the messages she had relayed, the efficient precision with which she had done her job, never questioning, never asking where the trains were going or what the numbers meant. She had not known, but she had not wanted to know. That night, the barracks was silent except for the sound of weeping. Some women cried openly. Others turned their faces to the wall, their shoulders shaking. A few sat upright, staring into the darkness, their minds replaying the film over and over. Margaret whispered to Anna, her voice raw. Did you know? Anna didn't answer immediately. She thought of the whispers she had heard, the rumors that were never confirmed, the orders that had seemed strange but were never questioned. I didn't want to know, she said finally. I think that's the same thing. The guilt shifted then, deepening, becoming something more complex than simple survivor's remorse. It was the guilt of complicity, of having been a small cog in a machine so vast and so evil that no single person could claim innocence simply by not knowing. Work continued, but the atmosphere changed. The women were quieter, more withdrawn. They performed their tasks with the same efficiency, but the levity, the occasional laughter, the small moments of normalcy vanished. One afternoon, Anna was working in the camp library, filing books and organizing the shelves. The library was small but well-stocked, filled with English books and German translations. She paused at a volume of Goethe, running her fingers over the spine, and she remembered her father reading Faust aloud in the evenings, his voice filling their parlor with poetry. But her father had also voted for the Nazi Party in 1933, had worn the swastika pin on his lapel, had believed that Germany's resurrection required strength and purity. She closed the book and placed it back on the shelf. Mrs. Callahan found her there, standing among the books, her face pale. "Are you all right?" Mrs. Callahan asked gently. Anna looked at her, this American woman with her kind eyes and her halting German, and she wondered how to answer. How could she explain that she was not all right, that she would never be all right again, that the soap and the apples and the clean sheets could not wash away what she had been part of? "I don't know," Anna said finally. Mrs. Callahan nodded, as if she understood. Though Anna doubted she truly could, meals became quieter. The women ate because they were expected to, because the body demanded fuel, but the enjoyment was gone. Greta stopped eating entirely for 3 days until Mrs. Callahan threatened to send her to the infirmary for forced feeding. After that, Greta ate, but mechanically, her eyes empty. And yet, despite the guilt, despite the horror of what they had learned, something else began to shift. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there. The women began to talk, not about the war, not about the camps, but about what came next, about whether it was possible to return to Germany, whether there was anything left to return to, whether they even wanted to. Anna and Margaret sat together one evening, sharing a cigarette that one of the guards had given them. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the camp, and the air was cooling. "I can't go back," Margaret said quietly. "Even if they let me, I can't." "Why not?" Anna asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "Because I can't pretend I didn't know I can't walk through Hamburg, what's left of it, and pretend I wasn't part of what made this happen. I can't look my mother in the eye and tell her I was just following orders." Anna took a drag from the cigarette, the smoke burning her lungs. "Then what will you do?" "I don't know. Maybe stay here. Maybe start over somewhere else. Somewhere where no one knows who I was." Anna thought about that starting over, becoming someone new, someone without a past. It sounded impossible. It sounded necessary. The camp held a strange tension as summer turned to autumn. The leaves on the trees outside the fence shifted from green to gold and the air grew cooler. Inside, the women had settled into a rhythm, their bodies healthy, their minds still grappling with the weight of what they had learned. The work continued. The meals continued. The routine continued. But beneath the surface, something was changing. The women were not the same people who had arrived in chains, terrified, and convinced they would be executed. They had been transformed, not by cruelty, but by its absence, by the steady, relentless kindness of a system that refused to dehumanize them even as it held them captive. In October, a new program was introduced. The women were offered English classes, taught twice a week by a local school teacher named Miss Harper. Attendance was voluntary, but nearly all of them signed up. Anna found herself drawn to the language, the way it sounded so different from German, softer in some ways, harsher in others. She practiced phrases in her notebook, writing them phonetically, sounding them out in whispers. "How are you?" "I am fine." "Thank you." Simple words, but they felt like keys to a new world. Miss Harper was patient, kind, and she did not treat the women as enemies. She corrected their pronunciation gently, praised their progress, and sometimes shared stories of her own life, her farm, her family, her brother who had been killed in Normandy. When she mentioned her brother, the room fell silent. Anna met her eyes, and for a moment, the distance between them collapsed. They were not captor and prisoner, not victor and vanquished. They were simply two women who had lost something to the war. In December, preparations began for Christmas. The camp administration announced that the women would be allowed to celebrate, to hold a small service, to decorate their barracks if they wished. At first, the women were uncertain. Christmas had been a time of propaganda in the Reich, a holiday stripped of its religious meaning and transformed into a celebration of Aryan tradition. But here, in captivity, they were being offered the chance to observe it as they remembered from childhood. They fashioned decorations from scraps, paper stars, chains made from torn sheets, small wreaths woven from pine branches gathered near the fence. The barracks, plain and utilitarian, began to look almost festive. On Christmas Eve, the mess hall was transformed. Tables were arranged in a square, and in the center stood a small tree, its branches decorated with candles and ribbons. The women filed in, their faces reflecting the soft glow of the candlelight, and they sang chorals, Stille Nacht, O Tannenbaum, songs that felt both familiar and strange in this foreign land. Mrs. Callahan and several of the guards joined them, standing quietly at the edges of the room. When the singing ended, the camp chaplain, a Presbyterian minister from Ohio, offered a prayer. He spoke in English, and Miss Harper translated into German. "Let us remember," he said, "that even in the darkest times there is light, that even in captivity there is grace, that even in guilt there is redemption." After the prayer, dinner was served. The Americans had prepared a feast: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, rolls, and for dessert, something the women had heard about but never tasted: apple pie. The slices were placed on each tray, golden crust flaking at the edges, the filling steaming and fragrant with cinnamon. Anna stared at hers, the fork heavy in her hand. She had been told that apple pie was as American as anything could be, a symbol of the country's abundance, its optimism, its simple pleasures. She took a bite. The sweetness was overwhelming, almost too much, but beneath it was something else: warmth, comfort, the taste of care. Someone had made this. Someone had peeled apples, rolled dough, measured spices, all so that prisoners could have a moment of something resembling joy. Around the table, the women ate in silence, their expressions ranging from wonder to grief. Some smiled, tentatively. Others wept. A few simply stared, unable to reconcile the act of eating pie in a prison camp with everything they had believed about the world. Margaret set down her fork and looked at Anna. "I don't understand this place." Anna nodded. "Neither do I." After dinner, the women returned to their barracks, and for the first time in months, there was laughter. It was quiet, hesitant, but it was there. Someone told a joke. Someone else sang a song. The weight of guilt did not lift, but for a moment it became bearable. Anna lay in her bunk that night, her stomach full, her body warm, and she thought about what the chaplain had said: redemption. Could there be redemption for what she had been part of? Could a person who had served the Reich, even in a small way, ever be forgiven? She didn't know, but she thought, perhaps, that the question itself was a beginning. In January, news arrived that repatriation would begin soon. The women would be sent back to Germany, to the Allied occupation zones, where they would be processed, denazified, and released into the shattered remains of their homeland. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some women were eager to return, desperate to find their families. Others dreaded it, knowing that the Germany they had left no longer existed. Anna was among the latter. She thought of Munich, of the cellar where her mother lived, of the ruins and the hunger and the cold. She thought of returning there, of trying to rebuild a life in a place haunted by ghosts, and she thought of staying, of finding a way to remain in America, to start over, to become someone new. But that was not a choice she was offered. In March, the repatriation began. The women were loaded onto trains, then ships, and the journey was reversed, back across the Atlantic, back to the ports of Europe, back to the land they had once called home. Anna stood on the deck of the ship as it approached Bremerhaven, the German coastline gray and indistinct in the distance. Around her, other women stood in silence, their faces unreadable. She thought of the soap and the apple pie, of the English lessons and the Christmas carols, of the strange, disorienting kindness that had reshaped her understanding of the world. She thought of what she had learned, not just about America, but about herself, about complicity and guilt, about the capacity for both cruelty and grace, about the fact that humanity persisted even in the most unexpected places. When the ship docked, the women disembarked, their suitcases in hand, their minds full of memories that would never quite fit into the narratives they would be asked to tell. Some would return to their families and never speak of their time in America. Others would carry the memories like talismans, reminders that even in captivity, even in defeat, it was possible to encounter mercy. Anna returned to Munich, to the cellar where her mother and sister lived. The reunion was quiet, tearful, filled with the weight of everything that had been lost. Her mother looked older, frailer, her hands thin and scarred from scavenging in the rubble, but she was alive. They sat together in the dim light of the cellar, a single candle burning between them, and Anna's mother asked, "What was it like? In America?" Anna thought of the soap and the showers, the eggs and the lemonade, the apple pie and the Christmas tree. She thought of the guilt and the confusion, the films of the concentration camps, the slow, painful reckoning with what she had been part of. "It was strange," she said finally. "They treated us well, better than we deserved." Her mother nodded, as if she understood, though Anna knew she couldn't possibly. Years later, Anna would leave Germany. She would emigrate to Canada, find work as a translator, marry a man who had also survived the war, though on the other side. She would build a life far from the ruins, far from the memories, but she would never forget. She would keep the notebook, the small brown cloth-bound book she had carried through the war and into captivity. In it were her thoughts, her fears, her slow transformation from a believer in the Reich to someone who could no longer believe in anything simple. And she would remember the taste of apple pie, the feel of soap on her skin, the sound of Christmas carols sung in a prison camp. She would remember that even in the darkest places, humanity could persist, that even enemies could show mercy, that even the guilty could be offered grace, though forgiveness might remain forever out of reach. The story of the German women POWs held in American camps during and after World War II is not widely known. It exists in the margins of history, overshadowed by the broader narratives of the war, the battles, the heroism, the atrocities. But it is a story worth remembering, not because it offers easy answers, but because it reminds us that war is not just a matter of armies and strategies, but of individuals, people who served systems they did not fully understand, who were caught in the machinery of ideology, who faced the consequences of choices made by others and by themselves. By the end of the war, approximately 12,000 German women had been taken into Allied custody. Most were members of the Wehrmacht auxiliaries, women who had volunteered or been conscripted into roles that supported the military machine, communications, logistics, administration. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but they were part of the war effort, and when the Reich collapsed, they were treated as prisoners of war. The American government, bound by the Geneva Conventions, provided for them according to international law. They were fed, housed, given medical care, and treated with a level of dignity that many found disorienting. This was not out of sentimentality, but out of principle. The United States sought to demonstrate that even in war, even toward enemies, certain standards of humanity could and should be maintained. For the women, the experience was transformative. They had been raised in a system that dehumanized its enemies, that portrayed Americans as weak and decadent, that demanded total sacrifice in the name of the folk. But in captivity, they encountered something different. They saw a nation that could wage total war and still afford to give soap to its prisoners. They saw guards who did not strike them, administrators who followed rules, a system that functioned not through terror, but through order. It was a slow, painful education, one that forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about the regime they had served and the world they had believed in. After repatriation, many of these women struggled to reintegrate into German society. The post-war years were harsh, marked by hunger, displacement, and the psychological toll of collective guilt. Some found ways to rebuild their lives in Germany, working in the reconstruction efforts, raising families, slowly piecing together a new normal. Others emigrated, seeking to escape the weight of the past, to start over in places where their history was not written on every ruined building, every mass grave, every memorial. Their stories were often untold. In a society grappling with its own complicity, the experiences of women who had served the Wehrmacht and then been treated well by the enemy were uncomfortable, difficult to fit into the narratives of victimhood and resistance that dominated post-war discourse. But the memories remained. In private letters, in diaries, in the quiet conversations between survivors, the echoes of those years persisted. Anna, who emigrated to Canada, lived until 1998. In her final years, she donated her wartime diary to a small historical society in Toronto, where it remains in their archives. a testament to one woman's journey from belief to doubt, from guilt to something that might, in time, become acceptance. In the diary's final entry, written in 1946, she reflected on her time in the American camp. I do not know if I can ever be forgiven for what I was part of. I do not know if forgiveness is even the right word. But I know this. The Americans showed me that it is possible to hold an enemy accountable without stripping them of their humanity. They gave me soap when I expected cruelty. They gave me apple pie when I expected starvation. They showed me in small, quiet ways that even in the heart of war, it is possible to choose mercy. I will carry that lesson with me, wherever I go, whatever I become. It will not erase what was done, but it will remind me that even in darkness, light persists. Even in guilt, grace is possible. Even in captivity, humanity endures. The camps closed, the women dispersed, the years moved on. But the story remains, a quiet reminder that history is not just made by leaders and generals, but by ordinary people. People who made choices, who lived with consequences, who struggled to understand a world that refused to fit into simple categories of good and evil. It is a story of soap and apple pie, of small mercies in a time of total war, of the strange, uncomfortable truth that even enemies can show each other humanity. And perhaps, in the end, that is the lesson worth remembering. Not that the Americans were saints, or that the Germans were innocent, but that even in the worst of times, even in the machinery of industrial slaughter and ideological fanaticism, individuals could still choose kindness. That choice did not erase the horror. It did not absolve the guilty, but it reminded the world that even when everything else had failed, even when nations had torn themselves apart, humanity could persist. One bar of soap at a time, one slice of apple pie at a time, one quiet act of mercy at a time. The war ended. The prisoners went home. But the memory of those moments, small, fragile, imperfect, remained. And in that memory, perhaps, lies a truth we still need. That even in our darkest hours, we can choose to see the humanity in those we call enemies. That even in captivity, even in guilt, grace is still possible. The soap has long since dissolved. The apple pie has been eaten. The camps are gone, but the echo remains. And it asks us, even now, what we will choose when faced with our own enemies, our own guilt, our own moments of reckoning. Will we choose cruelty or mercy? Dehumanization or grace? Vengeance or understanding? The German women who stood under those showers, who tasted that pie, who learned English in a prison camp, would tell us, I think, that the choice matters. That even when everything else is lost, that choice remains. And that is the story worth remembering.